welcome everyone to Women's Health Tech Wednesdays. My name is Nina Joshi, and with me today I have Stan Tsvirko, who is the head of medical affairs in the Innovation Lab over at Novartis. As you know, we love questions here at Women's Health Tech Wednesdays, so if you have any for Stan during the conversation, please feel free to utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will make sure that we get to it. So with that, we'd like to formally bring on our guest, Stan. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hey, Nina, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, so excited to learn a little bit more about yourself, your background, and some of the work that you are doing over at Novartis. So maybe if you could start things off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and really your journey into the healthcare space.
Sure, of course, I'd love to. So, my journey kind of started very early within, my schooling days. So back at school, what we actually had was, we had guidance counselors as you were transitioning from grade 11 and 12 into what you wanted to do. We had these meetings with these guidance counselors around, okay, what are the potential kind of job, career, and prospects that you might have. And this was back in the day before technology was really kind of like at the boom. We're kind of like at the preface of where we're starting out. And, I actually wanted to be a computer engineer, a programmer myself. Like, very interested in that. Those were my passions that I was working on. But back in that day, a lot of the work that was actually happening, or the technological transformations and innovations that were happening, were not happening in Australia, where I'm from. Or not even, like, I would say, even in the US, a lot of the work was actually being picked up and offshore to both other countries, such as in India and in China. We saw pretty big kind of like spaces there. So the advice for me was, man, listen, if you don't want to be, if you don't want to be really poor, we recommend that you look at another field. I mean, they obviously didn't know that Steve Jobs was cooking up something that's going to revolutionize the whole industry kind of going forward, right? And the moments like that, I was like, man, I really should have stuck with my gut, right? But look, it led me down a different pathway. So I went down the science pathway, which both my parents were scientists back in Belarus, where my heritage is originally from. So I went down that pathway, down the pathway of chemistry, right? And which then led me into chemical research, specifically working in with the CSIRO, that's the leading government body for Australia, right? And then from there, making my transition from research and development more into the pharmaceutical space, which is where I landed. So working for a company called Schering-Plough moving forward, and as I kind of got into that space, I really saw quite quickly that there were gaps within the pharmaceutical industry, which is predominantly more, how can I say, more conservative in their adoption of technology than any other industry out there. So as I started working within the pharma space, I started to kind of like lean back on my original roots of wanting to be a programmer. I wanted to develop systems and also enterprise systems. So I went back to college, and I did my master's in technology and business system design management, specifically focusing on enterprise systems to kind of help out the pharmaceutical industry. And basically, after completing that, this was with Swinburne University in Melbourne, I got the opportunity to really help develop a lot of the different marketing and strategy plans that companies kind of use today, as well as then also being asked to go to our global headquarters and work on a lot of things there, both on a corporate level as well as a commercial level too, and also medical now in the mix. And then after that, I actually ended up landing within the innovation lab here in the US. So it's been a pretty big kind of like journey around, but it's been a very fun one.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That sounds incredible. I love that you kind of already, just when you entered into the pharma space, saw a lot of areas of opportunity and really kind of dedicated a lot of time and energy to be the person or to be one of the forces for that type of positive change. Kind of on that note, I would love if you could give us a little bit more insight, really into your position being in an innovation lab, within the pharma space at Novartis. What kind of impact are you striving to make in that particular way?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. When we're looking at pharmaceuticals, innovation itself is so at the core of what all pharma companies wish to do, right? So this is where we want to play. And my department is in that kind of like gray zone. So it's it's in medical, right? But at the same time, what we try to do is find new partners that we can connect with, are trying to solve and define challenges or problems that we might have. We're trying to kind of like open up gateways to explore different ways of working, bringing in things such as like agile methodologies into the organization, bringing in open source, problem solving, engage in other parts of the world around what we want to be able to do, and how do we solve problems as well. The other big thing as well is partnering, for example, with organizations such as HITLAB and other ones across the country, sourcing kind of like talent and information so we can collaborate and work together on specific issues that we might have within our company, right?
Right. No, I like that. Like you're kind of thinking about it from all levels. Exactly,
right. And it's about I see the innovation lab as very much as kind of like an accelerator almost, so there is a lot of how can I say, within big organizations, there could be a lot of hurdles that you have to jump through, right? And within the innovation lab, it's about trying to prove value very quickly to understand, will this concept work? Does it meet the rigorous requirements that we have? And then bringing it back into the organization itself to say, hey, we have something here. We believe that this could give us an advantage X, Y, Z, or this can help our patients here, and here, right? And so we operate within that sphere that allows us to kind of experiment a lot more than you typically would inside the organization itself.
Right. I like that. It's kind of you're given a little bit more of that freedom to think more creatively and kind of think outside maybe some of the restrictions that can come with a large scale organization. I think that is a great environment to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so typically prior to us having the kind of like the innovation lab, when we used to brainstorm, right, we would sit down and we would have a challenge, and the first thing we'd do is list out all the reasons why we could not solve this challenge, right? So that's typically how a lot of the conversations would start in any organization that I worked at. Within the innovation lab, we put that to the side, and then we start to apply different methodologies, such as like the we have what's called the SIT, right? So that's the systematic inventive thinking methodology that we use, where we actually subtract all the negative, those kind of like limiting factors, build a virtual model, and then we retrofit like the reasons why it wouldn't work into that model, and to say, okay, so how can we overcome it, right? So it's a different way of thinking about it. Otherwise, if we just start with a negative straight away, we never get anything done, and then no one wants to try anything.
That's very interesting. That's a really cool way of looking at different solutions, to kind of start with how can we make it work, and then kind of retroactively layer in maybe some of the barriers and what can be done about that. That's fascinating. Wanted to talk to you a little bit more, a bit more broadly. So kind of in your view, how is big pharma really contributing to health tech innovation? I mean, this is a time where technology is so commonplace in a lot of health industry. So what is kind of the role that big pharma can play when it comes to health tech innovation? And then if possible, would love if you could share some examples or some types of projects that you typically work at to kind of help drive that.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I can give you one example that we work on. So I've kind of talked about this like open source innovation that we have, right? So one of the things that we've been playing with is partnering with companies that have almost like global think tanks outside of like within our conventional kind of like walls of an organization. So typically what happens is you will have a challenge or a problem that arises within your business, and it doesn't have to be necessarily related to pharma. It could be any business that you're trying to solve for. And typically to solve that problem, you would be engaging your network of people inside the organization, right, to try and address it. So, and then, for example, if you're trying to address these problems or these issues that you might have, then you're kind of in an echo chamber of solutions, right? So you're typically either trying things that have already been tried and tested, or you're more or less trying to get the same people to come up with the same solutions. Now, whenever we're looking at how organizations are built, there's always some kind of a layer that you could put on top of it, where you have certain biases that come in around the people that kind of get hired into the organization. So, so for example, and I try to really kind of emphasize this within the whole pharma space, right? Is to say that, we shouldn't just be looking at people with pharma experience. We shouldn't just be looking at working with companies with pharma experience, right? We should be looking outside, because it's those extra thoughts that actually can help really generate, or maybe certain things have been already thought about at a global level, right, elsewhere, that we can just bring in. It's cheaper, faster, and quicker for us. So using that premise, what we've done is, for example, we had one case study that I can kind of share around there was a very unique and very rare side effect that we were having from one of our drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And we needed to figure out and model exactly why we were getting this so that we can put it on the label, right? So we have to have it from a transparency perspective. And so we did the conventional way of doing stuff. So what we did is we got it, and we did clinical trials around it, very stringent, took 2.5 years, many millions of dollars, just to be able to identify the specific adverse event.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we had the kind of like results already set and we knew what we were looking for, we said, hey, now that we know the answers, what if we try to shorten this period down, right, significantly?
Right.
So we partnered with a company called Wasaku Incentive, who basically has this open source communities of experts all around the world, not just from pharma space, but from everywhere. And we do what's called a challenge post, right? So we posted the same challenge that we were having, right? Wrote everything up as if it was like a clinical trial type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
put it up there and said, you have 30 days to solve this.
Oh, wow.
Right. And within 30 days, we managed to get almost the exactly same results that we did over 2.5 year study. Right. And we had submissions from all around the world. We're talking from Africa, from Eastern Europe, from, from Western Europe, from Asia, from everywhere, right? And a lot of these group think tanks that we had were very, very much spot on, to such a point that we actually had to see, was it possible to a data leak or something else? But it wasn't. It was just because other people have experienced this, right?
Mm-hmm.
All these kind of like complications in other areas, and they knew how to solve for it very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I do like to talk about, when we talk about this with children, they say it takes a village to raise a child,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, in my opinion, it takes the whole globe to solve a real issue, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
we shouldn't be looking just internally for these kind of things, right? So let's break down those barriers, and if we're doing things for patients, we should be very much inclusive.
That is incredible. I really want to dive into kind of what you were saying about having a global perspective. But I also want to say, I love that you are kind of thinking about solving these problems in an industry agnostic way, not just kind of thinking about it within the lens of pharma, but really taking that broader step back, because I think technology is just so pervasive now in so many industries. Honestly, healthcare is probably one of the laggers when it comes to adoption. So I think that approach is really smart. Yeah, and so kind of
it's unique. It's unique and it's scary, right? So I mean,
yeah.
Because there's a lot of things that are unknown. But one thing is, like, there's a lot of from open source, there is a lot of possibilities and a lot of things that you can create. So one thing I like to tell people to do is, for example, a lot of people have Instagram. I don't know if you have Instagram, but like a lot of people have Instagram,
I'm familiar.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. If you go to Instagram, right? So it looks like a proprietary piece of software, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg paid a couple billion for it.
Yeah.
But it's all built on freeware.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the way that that it's built on freeware, if you go into these settings and the about section, it actually has every single person that contributed to the code in there.
Wow.
And it's all linked to what's called GitHub, right? So when we look at it from a technological perspective, what's made the internet explode as much as it has, and what's made our iPhones power, and the little things that we're used to, right, actually go to that next level of evolution where we're seeing the transformation completely of how technology is being used in cars, and like my fridge can talk to me now, like, and tell me it's out of milk.
Yeah.
All that is built by communities. It's not one company. It's the whole world working together to build that. And I think any organization, whether it's pharmaceuticals or banking or whichever one you look at, auto industry, they rely on those communities to actually really push them forward.
Absolutely. And I didn't even know that Instagram was built that way. That's so fascinating. What are some ways, I mean, now I'm so inspired, but I just by knowing this story, and I know you had mentioned like global think tanks. What are some other ways that, larger scale companies like Novartis can continue to make sure that it's bringing in diversity, that it's bringing in the community when it comes to building products or just solving challenges?
Yeah, I mean, look, so there's a couple of things as well that all companies are looking at, not just from a Novartis perspective. As one is increasing diversity within clinical trials. That's a number one thing, right? so making sure that we have good representation, not only is that great from a pharmacological perspective, right? So that you understand in different people how drugs react, but at the same time also kind of getting the community and lifting us up together from a health perspective, right? The other thing also is the post-COVID world that we're living in now has taught us a lot of things, right? And those are, first of all, technology is here to stay. It's not going to go away, right? People, you should be able to engage with people and engage in trials within both a physical space and also a virtual space. So companies are shifting towards that, you know, and I actually have a couple of colleagues who have been doing fantastic work around the kind of like the digital clinical trial space, where we're looking at different devices and how that helps with treatment, or how do you collect adequate data to then be able to do data mapping, and maybe even like when I was talking with people from Google, they're looking at doing like almost kind of like virtual data trials, like, you know, so when you have enough information about specific conditions and people, you can actually do trials without doing a trial for early pre-markers, so that you can identify which pathway you should take, like using the power of computers and the way that you kind of go forward. You know, so there's this exciting new space that we're kind of entering in. And I think, you know, especially when you ask anybody in pharmaceuticals, like what was the biggest accelerator for your company into the digital space? It's not the chief digital officer. It's not the latest gadget from Apple. It's been COVID, right? That's the number one thing that's accelerated everyone past anything else.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's very true. And kind of, you know, speaking of, I mean, COVID was a huge catalyst for so many things, but kind of now in this, you know, quote unquote post-COVID world, where are you particularly seeing kind of the future of healthcare moving towards? You know, what does that new normal kind of start to look like when it comes to delivering care for patients?
Yeah, well, I think that the virtual space definitely is a very big one, right? There's been, and these are kind of like my personal opinions, so these are not part of Novartis. You know, so please take this from me kind of trying to explain this.
It's just Stan sharing his wisdom.
Yeah. So it's my opinions, right? I think we need to preface this, but you know, like just the way, for example, from you know, from what I've seen, at least working in the US, the way that you would fulfill scripts and things like that is very different to the rest of the world, and the pharmacy system is different here. So there's a lot of space to be able to kind of grow, and we see the way that a lot of the insurance companies are going, you know, and especially where some of the big movements are, it's about consolidation there and being able to do cost tracking and, you know, trying to reduce costs where possible, and other players kind of stepping into the market. So there is definitely space to be played there, I would say. But the number one thing I think is the connection of your device, and having your device almost be like a personal coach or personal trainer with you at all times from a medical condition is probably the number one space for us to play in. Now, the hardest thing is, and it's hard to do in the US and in the Western countries compared to our countries in, you know, like China, for example. So China has an infrastructure called WeChat, you know, and WeChat is basically everything happens in there. So for example, you could create medical services or things to help patients within that one application. And because they all have WeChat, they automatically all have that on their phone, right? Here, you know, when we're looking at our infrastructures and the way that the things are built, you know, the closest thing we can get to that is either if you have iOS and you have Apple Health, right? But then most people are not using Apple Health. They'll, you know, if they have a Garmin watch, they'll have a Garmin Health. If they have something else, like, you know, they'll have something else, right? So, so it's like, how do we make sure that we break that barrier that is currently available for everyone to really install specific applications or things that are needed to help manage the patient more onto the device without the barriers that are there right now.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's interesting. It's like on one hand, you know, the democratization of all of these different types of tools is really great. But on the other hand, when it comes to developing infrastructure, you really have to make sure it fits for every single possible device, smartphone, etc., that someone could have their hands on.
Exactly. And versions as well. And like everyone's on a different iOS version. And yeah,
it can get really messy.
Very quick, right?
One question, I think, as you were kind of bringing up the use of wearables and just really being able to rely on technology to play such a big role of coach, advocate, kind of in people's lives. What are you kind of seeing from a trend perspective or just an interest, a bigger area when it comes to things like data and privacy? Because I know that's kind of becoming more of a question in consumers' minds when it comes to their relationship with technology.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And it's a really tough one. And I mean, I've pondered around data and privacy for quite some time, right? So originally coming from the European market where it's like super stringent with data, like everything is protected, everything's kind of like locked down. Coming to the US where certain things are not as locked down, but then you have your other protections policies that are kind of put in place, right? So I guess it kind of comes down to, for me, with the data stuff, there have been, for example, instances where companies might take a whole data set of outcomes, right, and actually provide that and put it out into the open market, and then other things can be discovered from it, right? So data in itself is actually pretty good, right? Especially with the new systems that we've got, the new computing powers that we have right now, we can run tests like you could not imagine, right? Not just us, but like, I mean, everybody can, with the right computational power, you can really get very unique endpoints and unique markers and unique things that you can really, revolutionize the healthcare industry with, right? The problem is that if someone takes that data and uses it for other things, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the line then needs to be drawn very kind of clearly and concisely. So I suppose it's like, if it's used in the right way, data is the best resource that we have securing all problems going forward, right? But at the same time, it can also be, as we've seen, misappropriated or misused, which then can cause other issues as well. The one thing, and again, personal opinion here, right? I would hate, for example, for insurance companies to get a hold of my health data, right, and then making decisions around policies around that, right? Because that's not right. Or like genetic data, things like that. Those are not the things that you would want out in the market, But at the same time, my data, for example, if you take a male such as myself from the region, from my age, and if I took something and then because of that and another activity, I had an outcome. If that goes into a database somewhere, and then more people like myself are having this, all of a sudden we get a marker come up. Okay, this is something for us to look into, and in let's say 20 years time, a product comes out that expands our life by another 20, 30 years. That's a win, right? So it's a very hard kind of like lines to cross. There are both positives and negatives. I personally believe that the positives outweigh the negatives, and I'm very much in this sense of kind of like aligned with the founder of Wikipedia that says that with Wikipedia they don't actually change the articles. They say that 95% of people are good people, 5% are not. So let's build a system for the 95% as opposed to the 5, right? And let the 95% to 5, police the 5, right? So so that's how Wikipedia is built. Like, I have a similar kind of like belief there as well personally, right? Built for the 95.
Yeah, well, it's just, I mean, like, I think that's just going to be the next challenge, this data paradox of how do we make sure that it's being used in a way for good while having, regulation or guardrails in place so that it can't be used for the bad. But that's the next challenge upon us. We do have some questions from the audience, so I want to see if I can get through at least one or two of them today. But we have a question that says, what is Novartis's perspective on more specific collaboration? So not just necessarily with clinicians, but co-producing with patients and other related stakeholders.
Well, I know, for example, if like there are constant collaborations happening with everybody. So depending on which side of the business you kind of sit, whether you're sitting on the commercial side, or whether you're sitting on the medical side, so the medical side is very much involved in the clinical development and kind of like the information sharing around a specific disease state. So, it's not as product focused. It's actually more like disease state focused on the pre-launch of the environment. And then when you're looking at the commercial side, then a lot more involvement with patient advocacy groups and the end users themselves, right? So that's where a lot of partnerships kind of happen there. And you would see some of these partnerships, whether on TV or on social platforms and things like that. So, but they're definitely open, right? I think all pharmaceutical companies are very much open to both being able to connect and engage and serve the community as much as they possibly can, right? So I would say if you have an idea for an interesting collaboration, please reach out, right? It could be something we're looking to.
That's amazing. Awesome. Yes, if anyone is interested in connecting with Stan after, all of his LinkedIn information is in the chat. So if you want to stay connected, I want to see if I can squeeze in one last question from our audience, which says, is the medical affairs role, are you involved in kind of getting a new product, whether that's a drug or other medical device, to pass government regulation? So does that kind of fit within the scope of what you do?
Not what I do, but definitely what colleagues do, right?
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So like I said, there's a whole arm of the kind of like the medical affairs group who are working on that.
Amazing. And then one last question, which is what we always like to end our episode, our Women's Health Tech Wednesdays on, is what, if you could share one lesson or piece of advice that you've learned from your career with us today, what would that be?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I've learned, especially within this industry, is the broader that you could be in your knowledge, right? The more that you can help out, right? So for example, so, even though I have a chemistry degree, I'm a chemical engineer, at the same time, the computing degree really helped me there. The marketing side helps you there as well. So, a lot of the time, to be very successful within this industry, it's about taking side steps a lot of the time, and not just trying to go up within one focus. So the broader your focus could be, the more we can help patients, because you're looking at problems from all angles, as opposed to the kind of like the finite angle that you would have.
That's a great piece of advice, and wholeheartedly agree. And on that note, Stan, just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Really great insights, really appreciated it. I think I've learned a lot too. So now I know a little bit more about Instagram code that I'm definitely going to tell people at like a next dinner party. So,
yeah, of course.
And so please be sure to check out our episode next week. We'll be interviewing Mandy from Microsoft. We also have our symposium next week, so please be sure to check that out. All the registration information is in the chat. We also have our podcast coming up. All of that information is in the chat as well. Wanted to thank our sponsors, Goodwin and Witham, for sponsoring this conversation, as well as Stan for a great discussion. And I'll see you all next week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.